Welcome to Speed Reads. Solidarity. Hear about one man's harrowing story of racial injustice and inhumane treatment in a Louisiana prison. Albert Woodfuck's Solitary Unbroken by 4 Decades in Solitary Confinement, My Story of Transformation and Hope. Narrated by Amanda Marr and Thomas Florio. It's hard to comprehend the painful reality of solitary confinement. To be locked in a 6 by 9 foot cell with just 1 hour's release a day is unimaginable for most of us. Albert Woodfuck's lived like this for over 40 years. Woodfuck's story is a grueling tale of racial injustice. He was framed for the murder of a prison guard. There was no forensic evidence against him. Witness statements were contradictory. But that didn't stop an all-white jury from reaching a guilty verdict. Woodfuck's resistance to abuse and agitation for change ensured he was a target for prison guards. But somehow Woodfuck's found the inner strength not just to survive, but to educate himself and to improve the lives of the prisoners around him. Woodfuck's grew up surrounded by poverty and racism and led a chaotic early life. Lesson 1 of 10 in 1947, Albert Woodfuck's was born in the quote-unquote Negro ward of Charity Hospital in New Orleans. His mother, Ruby Edwards, was 17 years old. His father was long gone. He was one of 5 children and grew up in intense poverty. If you're enjoying this summary so far, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. His mother was illiterate but worked hard to provide for the family. Sometimes she did odd jobs. Sometimes she worked as a barmaid. Other times she sold her body for money. She did what she had to give her children a better life. But times were tough. And sometimes, in order to eat, Woodfuck's needed to steal bread or go fishing in the Bayou St. John. The key message here is Woodfuck's grew up surrounded by poverty and racism and led a chaotic early life. In New Orleans in the 50s and 60s, racism was ever present and segregation was a legal reality. Woodfuck's could go to the movies but was only allowed to sit in the balcony. As Woodfuck's grew up, he noticed the impact of racism more and more. He saw how white people called black adults girl or boy and realized how disrespectful it was. Woodfuck's young life was mostly lived on the street. At age 12, he and his friends got involved in petty crimes, like stealing flowers from graveyards and selling them to tourists, or stealing bread from delivery trucks. Woodfuck's got better and better at leaping fences while running from the police. But when he got caught, the policeman, almost always white at the time, would search his pockets for cash to steal before beating him. Over time, Woodfuck's young pranks turned into more serious crimes. After getting mixed up in a car theft, Woodfuck's was sentenced to 2 years at a local jail named Thibodeau, where he was put on trash pickup duty along a nearby highway. He ran away after a few weeks, without any particular plan in mind. While escaping, he came across and stole a cement mixer and drove it at 10 miles an hour back to New Orleans. He was almost home when the cops spotted him and gave chase. The police caught Woodfuck's and beat him badly before charging him with escape, theft, and multiple other charges. This time, Woodfuck's wouldn't be returning to the low-security Thibodeau jail. He was going to the notorious Angola prison. Louisiana's Angola prison was a hellish environment where racism, corruption, rape, and violence reigned. Lesson 2 of 10 Angola had once been a slave plantation. When Woodfuck's arrived there in 1965, it didn't look or feel much different to one. African American prisoners worked the fields of the 18,000-acre site, while white prison guards holding shotguns yelled racist slurs at them. After arriving, Woodfucks and other new prisoners spent 30 days in a reception center. Then they were released into the prison itself. This was known as Fresh Fish Day. It was the day when the prison's sexual predators identified their targets. The key message here is, Louisiana's Angola prison was a hellish environment where racism, corruption, rape, and violence reigned. Sexual slavery was a core part of life at Angola prison. Woodfucks regularly saw men raped. A victim of rape at Angola became effectively a possession of his rapist and could expect to be used, abused, pimped out, or even sold. Guards tolerated rape, partly as it broke the spirit of victims. They even exploited the presence of sexual slavery. Guards could control particularly violent prisoners by threatening to move their slaves away or keep them well-behaved by allowing them to keep their victims. Some guards made money by selling the names of weak or young new inmates to predators. Prison life was filled with long, hard days of toil. The hardest work Woodfucks ever experienced was cutting sugar cane with his bare hands. It was a job so tough that it generated a secondary industry. Some inmates paid other prisoners to have their hands or legs broken to get out of sugar cane duty. Along with the brutal work was the constant threat of abuse from other prisoners or from the guards themselves. One day Woodfucks snapped at a provocation from a guard. He was charged with disobedience and sent to the dungeon. A 6-by-9-foot cell, the dungeon held 4 or 5 men. There was no bunk or chair, just a toilet. The prisoners were given bread 3 times a day. At 5 p.m., the prisoners were given a single mattress. Sometimes they would share it. Other times a bully would take it for himself. Sometimes a bully would take bread from the others, and Woodfucks heard of men also starving as a result. Sitting or lying all day on concrete, the dungeon was physically and mentally crushing. Woodfucks spent 15 days there. After 8 months in Angola, Woodfucks was released on parole. He was 19. He'd survived the notorious prison. He'd learned to be tough, to have courage, and to look out for himself. He was back on the streets. Woodfucks escaped from custody and wound up in a New York prison, where the Black Panthers changed his life. Lesson 3 of 10. Back in New Orleans, Woodfucks's criminal behavior escalated to the point he was running armed robberies in stores and bars. One crime Woodfucks never committed was rape, but he was charged with it. The police arrested Woodfucks for an armed robbery he'd committed, but also charged him with all the unsolved thefts, robberies, and rapes on their books. Cleaning the books like this was a common tactic at the time. The result was that innocent black men would often take a plea bargain, choosing a prison sentence for a crime they didn't commit, rather than languishing in jail for several years just waiting for a trial. Woodfucks was sentenced to 50 years for the armed robbery alone. The district attorney eventually dropped all the other charges against him, but they stayed on his record and would come back to haunt him decades later. The key message here is, Woodfucks escaped from custody and wound up in a New York prison where the Black Panthers changed his life. Right after being sentenced, Woodfucks launched a daring escape with the help of a gun planted for him in a courthouse toilet. On the run, he fled to Harlem, New York, but his freedom was short-lived. Arrested after being falsely accused of a robbery in Manhattan, Woodfucks was jailed there. He gave a fake name to avoid being sent back to Angola. Conditions in the Manhattan prison were grim, but there was one source of positivity. In the spring of 1970, 3 black prisoners were moved to the same tier of the prison as Woodfucks. There was something striking about them. They didn't seem downtrodden like most of the black men Woodfucks encountered. They carried themselves with confidence and pride. They were fearless but also kind. When they spoke with another prisoner, they would ask his name and whether he needed anything. Within just a few days, these 3 new prisoners were running the tier. Not through force, as was usually the case, but as a result of sharing their food and treating people well. They taught other prisoners to read. They established meetings at which they discussed concepts like racial oppression and economic inequality. The 3 men were members of the Black Panther Party for self-defense. The Black Panthers were a positive force and gave Woodfuck's identity, self-respect, and hope. Lesson 4 of 10. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale were college students in Oakland, California, when they founded the Black Panther Party for self-defense. The party grew out of attempts to stop police brutality in black neighborhoods. Newton and Seale started a cop-watching program to monitor the police harassment, intimidation, beatings, shootings, and killings that were a fact of life in their neighborhood. Sometimes, when a policeman was harassing a black citizen, Newton would stand to the side and read aloud relevant parts of the penal code to all those in earshot. If an arrest was made, Black Panthers would follow to the station and post bail. The key message here is, the Black Panthers were a positive force and gave Woodfuck's identity, self-respect, and hope. One common myth about the Panthers is that they were violent. But as Huey Newton once explained, the very nature of a panther is that it never attacks another creature itself. But if a panther is attacked or backed into a corner, it'll wipe the aggressor out. What violence there was associated with the party was often caused by FBI infiltrators. The Bureau spent millions infiltrating, surveilling, and disrupting the party. In fact, it was a clear rule of the party that no member could use a weapon unnecessarily or accidentally. But the sight of Panthers carrying guns, perfectly legal, as white people did, was so terrifying to mainstream public opinion that the Panthers were portrayed as violent. Even the National Rifle Association supported gun control restrictions in California as a result. For Woodfucks, the Black Panthers helped him to make sense of his world. The group taught him about institutionalized racism and the systemic injustice caused when police departments, juries, banks, universities, and institutions of all kinds are all white. He started to understand that the violent, depraved people he'd encountered in prison were uneducated, poor, subjected to violence and police oppression, and the victims of an unfair justice system. All that just because of the color of their skin. As Woodfucks learned, a light came on inside him. He embraced the 10 principles of the Panthers that demanded freedom for black people, decent housing and education, and the end of police brutality and murders. Almost 2 years after his courthouse escape, Woodfucks's true identity was discovered. On the transport back to Angola to serve out his sentence, Woodfucks made a commitment to himself. He'd done many wrong things in the past, but he was a criminal no more. From that day on, he'd do the right thing. Woodfucks set up a new branch of the Black Panthers in Angola, and was punished for it. Lesson 5 of 10. Back in Angola, Woodfucks was determined to spread the positive approach of the Black Panthers and to take action to improve life in the prison. Tackling rape was a priority. Along with Herman Wallace, another Black Panther among the prisoners, Woodfucks set up an anti-rape group. On Fresh Fish Day, the group met new prisoners, told them that the Black Panther Party would protect them, and escorted them to their dorms. If Woodfucks or Wallace saw a threat of rape, they stepped in. Sometimes with a quiet word that it wasn't going to happen. Sometimes they had to fight the would-be rapist. Prisoners, guards, and the prison leadership came to learn that the Black Panthers presented a threat to the status quo in Angola. The key message here is, Woodfucks set up a new branch of the Black Panthers in Angola and was punished for it. On the morning of April 17, 1972, a young white Angola guard named Brent Miller was murdered. Only a day before, 2 prisoners tried to set another guard on fire. Angola's head of security, Hayden Dees, and a local deputy sheriff named Bill Daniel interviewed prisoners one at a time. When it was Woodfox's turn for questioning, Dees shouted at him and accused him of murdering Miller. Woodfox simply replied that he had not. Then Deputy Sheriff Daniel pulled a gun on Woodfox and threatened to blow his brains out. Daniel shouted that he wasn't scared of any Black Panthers. The 2 men restrained Woodfox and took him to the dungeon. All day long, prison guards came in to beat him. The next day, Woodfox was taken to Closed Cell Restricted, or CCR, the solitary confinement section of the prison. So was fellow Black Panther Wallace, who'd also been accused of the guard's murder. The 2 men were being set up. The day Miller was murdered, a deputy warden told a reporter that he had no explanation for the killing. But the following day, the story had changed. Prison Warden C. Murray Henderson told the newspapers that Black militants were responsible for the murder and that prison officials had found a typewritten, anonymous letter from a prisoner taking credit for the burning of the guard. The letter was signed on behalf of something called the Vanguard Army, a Black Power organization. Woodfox had never heard of a group called the Vanguard Army. And no Black prisoners even had access to typewriters. There was no evidence against him, but the narrative was clear. The murder was the work of Black militants, and he was stuck in solitary as a result. Conditions in solitary confinement were bleak, but Woodfox tried to improve them. Lesson 6 of 10 in solitary confinement, Woodfox's new cell was 6 by 9 feet. He could take 5 steps up the cell and 5 steps back. There was a bunk, a ceramic toilet and sink, and a metal table and bench. Across the hallway from Woodfox's cell, there was a window. There was no outside exercise yard for prisoners in the CCR, so some prisoners hadn't gone outside for years. Once a day for an hour, the prisoners were allowed out of their cells and could walk the hallway or take a shower. There was no hot water and no fans in the summer. Rats and mice ran the halls at night. Any time a prisoner had to be taken off the tier, they were made to strip, bend over, and were subjected to a visual cavity search. Then they were placed in full restraints. Woodfox didn't know it at the time, but this was to be his home for the next 43 years. The key message here is, conditions in solitary confinement were bleak, but Woodfox tried to improve them. Woodfox was determined not to be broken by the awful conditions. He fought for respect, dignity, and a slightly more bearable life. He did so together with his friend Wallace and another inmate in Black Panther, Robert King. Together, the 3 encouraged other prisoners to take action. For example, the prisoners would collectively refuse to go back into their cells after their hour of release in an attempt to force the guards to give in to basic requests, like giving the prisoners toilet paper. Often in response to these actions, the guards would flood the tier with a cloud of tear gas. That was the prison's standard tactic to break resistance. Often, guards would beat the prisoners. Other times, a more sympathetic guard might actually give them the toilet paper. Realizing that Woodfox, Wallace, and King were organizing acts of resistance, the prison guards decided to separate them into different parts of the unit. But separation didn't stop their determination. Each of the 3 taught themselves the law during this time, using books from the prison's library. Woodfox read case law night and day, and over time, he started to file lawsuits about prison conditions. Gradually, they gained new privileges, the right to have books and to subscribe to newspapers, permission for fans and radios in their cells. In the mid-70s, mosquito nets were installed on the windows. There were small steps forward, but life was a constant, wearying battle for survival. Woodfux's conviction for the murder of Brent Miller was a racist miscarriage of justice. Lesson 7 of 10. As trial for the murder of Miller approached, local Black Panthers set up a support committee to raise funds for Woodfux's defense. Its members included a white activist couple, Harry and Jill Schaefer, who both took leadership roles on the committee. No funds ever arrived. Inside Angola, Woodfux assumed that people had just moved on. Later, he learned that the Schaefers were paid $16,000 a year by the FBI to disrupt local activist organizations. FBI documents released under the Freedom of Information Act showed that the Schaefers had sabotaged efforts to get lawyers for Woodfux and for Wallace, who was standing trial separately. The men were instead represented by a young, inexperienced lawyer. The key message here is, Woodfux's conviction for the murder of Brent Miller was a racist miscarriage of justice. The state's prosecution case was based on the eyewitness testimony of 3 prisoners, each of whom claimed to have seen Woodfux entering the room where Miller was killed and leaving with bloodied clothes. One of these witnesses was blind in one eye and injured in the other, and another was a brutal pimp known for feeding information to guards in return for coffee and food. The testimonies of the 3 men were completely contradictory. One said Woodfux was wearing a blue shirt and pants. Another said he wore dungarees and a button-up shirt. The legally blind witness claimed Woodfux wore a white t-shirt and jeans and was wearing a hat. Later, each of the 3 witnesses were given better living quarters. 2 were released from Angola into less unpleasant prisons. One was granted weekend release. He used his newfound freedom to rob 3 banks. No forensic evidence pointed to Woodfux's guilt. A handmade knife had been entered into evidence as a murder weapon. A prison guard claimed it had been covered in blood, but forensics experts testified that there hadn't even been enough blood to test it. A clear, identifiable, and bloody fingerprint was found near the body, but it didn't match Woodfux or Wallace's fingerprints. And even though the prison had all fingerprints on file, no other prints were tested. As the trial came to an end, the jury took under an hour to deliberate. The verdict? Guilty. Woodfux was sentenced to life. Weeks later, Wallace was also found guilty and also sentenced to life. Woodfux was taken back to his solitary cell. He'd been framed and wrongfully convicted, and he was clear about the reasons why. It was because he was a black man and a Black Panther. Throughout Woodfux's solitary confinement, conditions were cruel and inhumane. Lesson 8 of 10. As the generation of guards who had personally known Brent Miller moved on, new guards arrived. Many admitted that, during their training, they'd been told that Woodfux, Wallace, and King were dangerous and militant prisoners. The new guards were surprised to discover that the Angola Three, as they'd come to be known, weren't violent, racist bullies, but polite prisoners with good records. But there were always guards who relished their power and control. In just one of many incidents in the 1980s, a guard opened Woodfux's cell door to allow another prisoner to beat Woodfux up. Woodfux defended himself. In an example of the system's perversity, the state used a write-up of the incident as an example of Woodfux's violence and a justification for keeping him in solitary confinement. The key message here is, throughout Woodfux's solitary confinement, conditions were cruel and inhumane. Even after decades in solitary, Woodfux was being subjected to degrading strip searches. In 2013, during one of his many court cases pursuing freedom, he told a federal court that he was strip-searched multiple times a day. Visual anal cavity inspections were degrading and stressful, he said. They were also absurd, given his decades-long record of good behavior. In response, a representative of the prison justified the strip searches on the grounds that in 1977, 36 years earlier, a handcuff key had been found in Woodfux's cell. Setting aside the large time gap since the incident occurred, the key had, in fact, been planted. Simply being in solitary was torture itself. Prisoners had no control of their lives, and small things like a change in routine could cause them to break. Woodfuck saw prisoners scream and shake their cell bars for a breakfast tray that didn't arrive on time. Usually, these men would be gassed and sent to the dungeon. The mixture of mental and physical harms that were inflicted on Woodfuck and other prisoners in solitary confinement were enough for United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture to speak out against them. Juan E. Mendez said that Woodfux's decades-long experience in solitary clearly amounts to torture. Woodfuck himself worked hard to survive. He made his bed each morning and kept his cell clean. He exercised, he read, he educated himself, and he drew on his enduring and deep friendship with Wallace and King. But even he has said that his time in prison defied description. It was a form of torture. Throughout his long battle, the criminal justice system worked against Woodfuck. Lesson 9 of 10 Woodfuck fought a long battle for his freedom. He and his lawyers filed many appeals and appeared at many hearings over the course of a decade. In one reindictment proceeding in 1993, he faced a grand jury that included amongst its members a woman called Ann Butler. Butler was the wife of C. Murray Henderson, the warden of Angola who had helped to frame Woodfuck for the murder 20 years before. Not only was Butler allowed on the jury, she actually passed around copies of a book that she and her husband had written about Angola. The book included an inflammatory account of the Miller killing. It also claimed, entirely falsely, that Woodfuck was a convicted rapist. The key message here is, throughout his long battle, the criminal justice system worked against Woodfuck. In 2008, Woodfuck had been in solitary confinement for 36 years. The Louisiana prison system and state officials were determined to keep him there, despite increasing political pressure for his release. Faced with the possibility that Woodfuck might be temporarily released on bail where he'd live with his niece, the Louisiana Attorney General James Buddy Caldwell took drastic action. Caldwell emailed neighbors of the niece, calling Woodfuck a violent, convicted rapist and sex offender. The claims were based on the abandoned charges on Woodfuck's file from the night in 1969 when the police had cleared their books. They were lies, pure and simple. But Caldwell told National Public Radio that Woodfuck was the most dangerous man in America. Meanwhile, when called on to test the bloody fingerprint at the scene of the murder, Caldwell refused to do so. 2012 marked 40 years in solitary for Woodfuck. By now, he had an effective support committee, excellent lawyers, and the support and advocacy of Amnesty International behind him. But still, he faced a tough battle. Despite decades of good behavior, the Louisiana prison system and state officials still alleged he was a dangerous man. The State Corrections Secretary James LeBlanc said that Woodfuck and Wallace had to be kept in CCR as they represented a danger to prison employees, visitors, and to other inmates. Meanwhile, in prison, Woodfuck was still being hassled for daring to support black empowerment. Books or mail sent to him mentioning the Black Panthers were confiscated for encouraging racial hatred. His fight went on. Woodfuck secured his freedom, but his fight for racial justice goes on. Lesson 10 of 10 in 2016, after countless appeals and legal battles, Woodfuck finally had the opportunity for a retrial. But his lawyers made a suggestion. Take a deal based on time served, they said. Woodfuck was never willing to accept guilt in return for freedom. But this time, he had the opportunity to make a no-contest plea. His conviction would stand, but he could maintain his innocence. And he'd be free. The alternative of a retrial carried a chance of reconviction, and with it, the rest of his life behind bars. Woodfucks was 68 years old. His mother and sister had died while he was in prison. His friend Herman Wallace had died, too. He'd not been allowed to go to their funerals. He knew in his heart that he was innocent. Woodfucks chose freedom. The key message here is, Woodfucks secured his freedom, but his fight for racial justice goes on. Back in society, Woodfucks had a lot to learn. How to walk without restraints. How to let himself eat when he was hungry. And he had new memories to make. Years before, he'd seen a National Geographic TV special about Yosemite National Park, and ever since dreamed of visiting. He traveled there with friends and hiked to waterfalls. Today, Woodfucks is an advocate against solitary confinement and racial injustice. While things have gotten better, he believes that improvements in policing and justice are superficial. A U.S. Sentencing Commission study from 2012 to 2016 found that a black man typically received a 20% longer sentence than a white man for the same crimes. Meanwhile, police officers continue to kill black males. In 2016, the year of Woodfucks's release, a police officer shot and killed a black man named Philando Castile in Minnesota. When shots were fired, Castile was reaching to get his wallet. In that year, 1/3 of the unarmed people killed by police officers were black, while black people made up only 13.4% of the U.S. population. As of 2019, there are still over 80,000 people in solitary confinement in the United States. Democratic Congressman Cedric Richmond has said that solitary confinement is not reserved for the very worst. Too often, it's used to avoid mental health treatment or rehabilitation for prisoners who could return to society. Woodfucks himself has his freedom, but his fight for a better prison system, justice system, and society continues. Final summary. The summary's main takeaway is that Albert Woodfucks was locked down for 23 hours a day for over 40 years. He was framed for the murder of a prison guard simply because he was a Black Panther and an activist. A judicial and penal system tainted by racism kept him behind bars for decades, despite a lack of evidence against him. But through a commitment to the principles of the Black Panthers and a determination to improve and educate himself, he survived. How can you apply Albert Woodfucks's story to your own life? Educate yourself as a starting point towards making imprisonment more humane. Follow Prison Legal News and Solitary Watch on social media to learn more about the realities of how people behind bars are treated. And if there's a single thing you can do to help bring some humanity to prisons, do it.